We made it to fall. That means it's officially open season on pies. So today, I'm gonna show you how to make my favorite pie crust. Hi there, welcome back to my kitchen. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. Today we're making pie crust. Pie crust at its most basic is flour, some water, and some sort of fat, whether it be butter or shortening or lard. I'm adapting a recipe that my mom used to use that was a full shortening recipe and adding some butter into it. I like a little bit of butter for the flavor and the flakiness, but the shortening ensures that this pie crust is super easy to work with. Her crust also has an egg and a little bit of vinegar in it, and I'm sure there's some science behind that, but what it means to me is just a really nice, reliably flaky pastry crust. So I'm gonna show you how I make that today. The key to pie crust is cold ingredients. So I've just taken a couple sticks of butter and some shortening out of the fridge. I have some ice water on my bench, and I've also heard of people refrigerating their flour before they start to build a pie crust. The reason for that is because cold pastry leads to flakier pastry. When your dough hits a hot oven, the butter or shortening or fat starts to melt a little bit and create steam, which puffs up the pastry and creates a flaky layer. All I know is that this method gives me that flaky crust that I want every single time. So before my ingredients heat up, let's get going. So in a bowl, I have several cups of flour, and I'll include the exact recipe in the description box below. This makes 2 crusts. So if you have a pie that calls for a bottom and a top crust, this is a great recipe. Or you can always store crust in the freezer, just tightly wrapped in plastic, defrost it in the fridge before you want to use it, and it's as good as the day you made it. So we're starting with flour, then adding a little bit of salt. I'm gonna whisk those things together just to combine. And then I'm going to cut in using a pastry cutter, which is this funny looking tool. You can also use a couple of forks or a couple of knives, or you can even use your fingers if you work really quickly. The trouble with using your hands is that the heat in your hands warms up the butter a little bit, so it's harder to keep things cold. But forks or knives will absolutely do the trick. Then I've got a cup each of butter, which I've cubed, again, straight out of the fridge, so it's very cold, and shortening. This is vegetable shortening. You can use Crisco, you can use whatever type of shortening you like. It's gonna go right in. And then using my pastry cutter, I'm gonna cut those 2 things together. All this means is that we're cutting through the butter and mixing it with the flour. The intent is to end up with something that looks like pea-sized or even a little bit smaller than that, so that there are still some visible chunks of butter and shortening in our final crust. That's what creates those layers of steam. So you just go in with your pastry cutter and start cutting these 2 ingredients together. So what the pastry cutter does is with these couple of blades, it starts to separate the butter and the shortening into smaller pieces and coat it in the flour. You don't necessarily want to dawdle on this step, but you do want to make sure that your flour and your butter or other fat are mixed together pretty well. So I'm not quite there yet, but you can see it starting to happen where the butter and shortening are creating little pebbles in the flour. I like this recipe because it's kind of foolproof. The shortening makes it a little bit easier to roll out and work with, and the butter gives it a really nice flavor. But I also like it because it's nostalgic. It's the recipe my mom always used, and the recipe I learned when I first started making pies. Okay, this is looking pretty good. There's still a little bit of flour that's not been incorporated, which is fine because we're gonna add some liquid. But for now, I'm gonna call the butter cut into the flour. Let me show you what that looks like. So I've created a well in the center of our dough, and now we're gonna mix up the water, vinegar, egg mixture. So on the bench, I have some ice water. We're not gonna use all of this, but I wanted to cool the water down so that it was as cold as possible when it hit the dough. I'm gonna crack 1 egg into a measuring cup. Add to that 2 tablespoons of vinegar. You do not taste the white vinegar in the final product at all. Now we mix. So I'm just scrambling this egg a little bit into the vinegar. So we're gonna measure up to 1 cup of liquid, and this can vary up or down a couple tablespoons depending on a lot of things. Depending on the season, depending on the flour that you're using, depending on whether you weighed or measured in a cup your flour. So at the end of this, we're looking for a consistency and a texture, and I'll show you what that looks like. But I'm gonna have about a cup of the egg vinegar water mixture ready. So that egg plus the vinegar made about 1/4 cup. So I'm gonna add 3/4 of a cup more of our ice water. When you're using a measuring cup like this, it's very hard to tell where you are looking from the top down. So I always try to get on the level of the measuring cup and just make sure the liquid is at the line. I'm gonna keep this beside me on the bench, just in case my flour needs a little bit more water to get the texture that we want. So now, using a fork, same fork that I scrambled the egg with, I'm just gonna start slowly incorporating this. I'm not doing it all at once. I don't wanna take this too far and make it too wet, though if it does get too wet, I can just add a little bit more flour. A little bit more. So it's starting to stick together, but it's still not moist enough. So I'm gonna add a little bit more, but still reserve some. Okay, we're getting really close. It's starting to stick together. Some parts of it are wetter than others. Some are still kind of dry. So this is the point that I like to gently and quickly get in with my hands. There's no way to tell how your dough looks until your hands are kind of in it, as far as I'm concerned. So you want the dough to stick together. You don't want too many dry spots, but you also don't want it to stick to your hands too much. You don't want a wet dough. You're not trying to knead it here. You're just trying to bring it together. I think that's enough. I think we're gonna leave that 1 tablespoon of liquid behind. I think this is plenty for the flour that I have. There's our dough. 2 sheets of cling wrap. Get those ready for me here on my bench. And I'm gonna turn this out onto my bench, actually. And the goal here is to incorporate this flour gently into this mound of pie crust. So that is as far as I'm gonna take it. I don't wanna overwork the dough at all, and when I'm shaping it into a disc to put on our plastic wrap, I'm gonna work it a little bit more. So separating it in half as evenly as I can, just gently with my hands. Bringing the dough together, flattening it out, and that's it. Onto the plastic wrap it goes. Same with this side. Bringing it together, flattening it out, onto the plastic wrap it goes. Now I'm just gonna wrap the dough tightly in plastic wrap. You can use beeswax paper here if you like. You can reuse plastic wrap. Gently with my hands, push it out to the edges of that plastic wrap. And that dough disc is ready for the fridge. Same with this one. So at this point, you could put these directly into your freezer and leave them there until you're ready to use them. But I'm gonna show you how I roll out, fit it into a pie tin, flute the edge, and blind bake the crust. So these two going into the fridge for me for at least a couple of hours, and I'll be back to you when it's chilled down and we're ready to bake it. Crust has been chilling for a few hours now, so it should be ready to roll. We are going to blind bake this crust, and that means that you bake it without anything in it in the oven before you put the fillings in it. A blind baked crust is great for things like quiche, which is what I'm making. It's great for cream pies, sometimes pumpkin pies. It's a tool that you should have in your arsenal. Some people use pie weights to weight down the crust when there's nothing in it and they're baking it blind. The purpose of that is if you don't have something to weight the crust down, it will puff up and lose its shape. So for me though, instead of investing in pie weights, my pie weights are simply some rice. You can use this several times. It's probably not good to cook and eat after you've used it to weight down your pie. But in this container, I just keep a whole bunch of rice and a piece of crumpled parchment paper. And I'll talk you through that in a second when we get to that point. So the only other thing on my bench is a pie pan. This is a 9-inch pie pan. You can use whatever size that you have. Just keep in mind when you're rolling out your crust, you want it to be a couple inches wider than the diameter of your pie pan so that it can seat down well into the pan itself. I have a rolling pin. This rolling pin is cool because it has these little guides on the edges that show you when your crust is 1/8 of an inch thick, which is what we're going for today. You don't need one of these at all. In fact, you can just use a traditional rolling pin and gauge with your eyes how thick you want your crust, but this is my main rolling pin, so I'm gonna use it. And then last thing is just a cookie sheet, and the cookie sheet is just for ease in and out of the oven of the pie. On a clean bench, flour. Turn my crust, which you can see little pieces of butter in that crust, which is great. Turn my crust out onto the floured surface. Give it a little rub with flour. Now, just like when we were prepping this dough, we don't want to handle it a ton. We don't want to leave it out for too long. I don't want to sit here and jabber to you for too long. The goal is to keep it as cold as we can. If it starts to stick, that means two potential things. One, you need to use a little bit more flour, or two, it's getting too warm. Abort mission, put it back in the fridge and wait for a while. To get a flaky crust, you don't want to mess with it too much and you want to keep it cold. So we're going to get going. I just start to roll, flipping about a quarter turn each time. It's okay if you've got some tears in your dough. We can work it back together. You sometimes have to adjust the amount of flour you have. Sometimes you'll get little cracks. That's no problem. Just continue working, rotating around. The rotating is so you can get closer to a circle, but also so that your dough doesn't stick or doesn't have as good of a chance to stick on your bench. If your dough tears a little bit, it's really not a problem. You can really fix a lot once it gets into the pan. If you've got too much flour, like I did when I started, just move it to one side. You want to stop partway through, put your pie pan upside down and measure to see if you have enough. It looks like I have plenty of crust here. So this is the time when there's a few different ways to do this part in particular. What I like to do is start at one end of the crust, gently fold it up over my rolling pin, fold it in on itself really gently, move my pan, then lift and gently roll it out quickly. You're going to then lift up the edges of your pie crust, gently maneuver it down into the bottom of the pie pan. What you don't want to do is push with your fingers. What that will do is create thin spots in your crust and it has a chance to tear. If it does tear here, not a huge deal. What you need to do is use a little bit of water in your fingers and just mold it back together. So as an example, there's a little tear. A little bit of water on my finger. Mold it back together. Perfect. Okay. So our crust is into the bottom of our pie tin. This next step is however you want to do it. So I like to leave a little bit of a border to tuck under the pie. So all I do is cut, leaving a little bit of that crust. This does not have to be perfect. You don't want to leave too much because if you have a really thick crust, it won't cook. All the way around. Gather up those scraps. They can make pie crust cookies. You can cut shapes out with them to put on the top of whatever it is you're making. I'm going to toss this in the fridge for 2 minutes while I clean up. Clean bench. 2 minutes later. So now is the part when we decorate the edge of the pie. I like a fluted crust. I'm going to show you how I do that, but there's so many different ways to do this. So pick the way that you like the most. First, we're going to take our excess crust and just roll it under. Just gently rolling it under, pinching a little bit. We're going to do some pinching in the fluting step. Gently rolling it under. If your crust is sticky at this point, again, probably needs more time in the fridge, or you can flour your hands a little bit. Okay, so our crust is all rolled under, looking good. So now to flute the edge. And the way I do it is to use my index finger and my thumb on one hand and my index finger on the other. Pinch and push. Pinch and push. If you want to flute an edge, I would encourage you to pick the fingers that make the fastest work of this for you. And we have a fluted edge. Again, working quickly, put the pie weights into our pie. So this is just a piece of parchment paper. You can reuse this a couple times, but it will get a little bit greasy from the pie, so you'll have to switch it out at some point, but it's a little bit reusable. So the reason the parchment is crumpled is so that it sits nicely into the bottom of the pie, but the first thing I'm gonna do is called docking the crust. That means taking a fork, putting some fork marks in the bottom of the crust. You dock the crust for the same reason, to make sure that the bottom of the crust doesn't rise or enable the walls to collapse in on themselves. So I'm pre-docking the crust because we are gonna blind bake this pie shell in the oven with some pie weights in it, but then we're gonna remove the pie weights so that the bottom of the crust also gets cooked and put it back in the oven. So docked the crust in advance. Now we just pretty gently tuck our parchment down in the bottom of the pie. And all I do then is pour the rice in. So the parchment is just to keep the rice from touching the crust. And there we have it. So now it's time to blind bake. 375-degree oven. I'm gonna cook it with the pie weights in for about 15 minutes. Pull them out, put it back in, and cook it for another 10 or so minutes. I'll let you know how long exactly it takes when it's done. And here we have a blind baked crust. So there's a couple different levels of blind baking. You can do a partial blind bake or a full blind bake. I would recommend consulting your recipe to determine which is appropriate for you. This level of blind baking is perfect for the quiche that I'm gonna make to make use of this delicious pie crust. If you're interested in the recipe for a delicious fall flavored quiche, keep an eye on this space. That video will be up soon. Thank you so much for being here today, spending your time with me as I made pie crust. I hope this is helpful in your fall baking endeavors. Let me know if you have a favorite pie crust recipe in the comments below. I'm always on the hunt for great recipes, and I find that you all have a lot of them. If you liked this video, please give it a like. If you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you here next time. Cheers.